When Thorne Maddox pulled the drowning Apache woman from the Rio Grande's deadly current, he thought he was simply saving a life. But ancient tribal law declared something far more binding by rescuing Sana from the waters she now belonged to him. What started as an act of mercy would become a battle between two worlds, two hearts, and a sacred law that neither could escape. Welcome to today's story, where survival meets destiny on the untamed New Mexico frontier. Stay with me until the end to discover how love can bloom from the most impossible circumstances. And don't forget to comment below with your city, so I can see how far this tale of forbidden love and ancient traditions travels across the world. The morning sun blazed merciless over the New Mexico territory, turning the Rio Grande into a ribbon of molten copper as it carved its way through the harsh landscape. Thorne Maddox squinted against the glare, his weathered hands steady on the reins, as his horse picked its way along the rocky bank. At 42, Thorne had learned to read the desert. Like scripture, every shadow held meaning, every sound carried warning or promise. Today something felt wrong. The silence was too complete. Where were the birds? The usual rustle of small creatures moving through the sagebrush. Even his horse, a reliable bay mare named Dust, seemed uneasy, her ears twitching at sounds Thorne couldn't detect. He'd ridden out before dawn from his small ranch tucked into a hidden valley 20 miles south. The cattle needed water, and the Rio Grande was running higher than usual after the late summer storms. But as he crested the ridge overlooking his favorite watering spot, Thorne pulled up short. Something was floating in the water. At first he thought it might be debris, a fallen branch, maybe a dead animal swept downstream. But as his eyes adjusted to the dancing light on the water's surface, his blood turned cold. It was a person. "Jesus Christ," Thorne muttered, spurring Dust forward. The horse plunged down the steep bank, sending loose stones scattering into the river. As they drew closer, Thorne could see it was a woman, her long black hair spread like dark silk across the water's surface. She was face down, arms splayed wide, her doe-skin dress billowing around her like burial shrouds. She wasn't moving. Thorne didn't hesitate. He'd seen too much death in his 42 years in the war on the frontier, in his own home, to waste precious seconds on deliberation. He dismounted while Dust was still moving his boots, hitting the muddy bank at a run. The water was deeper than it looked, the current stronger. By the time he reached her, the river had pulled him waist deep into its cold embrace. She was heavier than he'd expected, waterlogged and limp as he struggled to turn her over. Her face was pale beneath the copper of her skin lips, tinged blue eyes closed. Apache, he realized immediately. The fine bone structure, the traditional dress, the intricate beadwork on her moccasins, all spoke of the people who had lived in these mountains long before men like Thorne had arrived with their cattle and claims. "Come on, girl," he grunted, fighting against the current as he dragged her toward shore. "Don't you die on me now." The river seemed determined to keep its prize, clutching at them both with invisible fingers. Thorne's legs burned as he fought for purchase on the slippery rocks, the woman's dead weight threatening to pull them both under. For one terrifying moment he felt the current winning, felt his boots sliding on the smooth stone beneath the surface. Then his foot found solid ground. He hauled her up onto the bank with the last of his strength, both of them collapsing onto the muddy shore in a tangle of wet limbs and sodden clothing. Thorne rolled away from her, gasping, then immediately turned back. She still wasn't breathing. "No, he muttered, rolling her onto her side. Water poured from her mouth and nose, but her chest remained still. Thorne had seen enough drowning victims to know he had maybe minutes before it was too late. He'd learned the technique from an old army surgeon during the war, a way to force water from the lungs and coax breath back into the dying. His hands shook as he positioned her on her back, tilted her head, and placed his mouth over hers. The first breath he forced into her lungs brought up more water. The second seemed to disappear into her still chest. On the third, she convulsed. Water erupted from her mouth as her body arched off the ground. Thorne rolled her quickly onto her side as she coughed violently, river water and bile spattering the muddy bank. Her eyes flew open dark as midnight, wild with panic and confusion. She tried to speak, but only harsh coughing emerged. Her gaze darted around frantically the river, the strange white man kneeling beside her, the horse standing nearby, and Thorne could see the exact moment when memory crashed back into her consciousness. She scrambled away from him with surprising strength for someone who'd been half dead moments before, her movements quick and fluid despite her obvious weakness. When her back hit a large boulder, she stopped pressed against it, like a cornered animal, her dark eyes never leaving his face. "Easy," Thorne said, raising his hand slowly. "Easy there. You're safe." She said something in Apache, a rapid string of words that sounded like both question and accusation. Her voice was hoarse from the water and coughing, but there was steel in it. This was not a woman accustomed to helplessness. "I don't understand," Thorne replied, keeping his voice low and calm. "I pulled you from the river. You nearly drowned." Her eyes narrowed as she studied him, taking in his worn rancher's clothes, his sun-weathered face, the way he kept his hands visible and non-threatening. She spoke again, slower this time, and though Thorne didn't know the words, her tone had shifted from panic to wariness. "My name's Thorne," he said, touching his chest. "Thorne Maddox, I found you in the water." She watched him for a long moment, then attempted to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and she would have fallen if Thorne hadn't moved quickly to steady her. The moment his hands touched her arms, she stiffened, but she didn't pull away. "You're hurt," he said, noticing for the first time the bruise darkening along her left temple, the cuts on her hands and arms. These weren't injuries from the river. Someone had hurt her before she'd ended up in the water. The realization hit him like a physical blow. She hadn't fallen in by accident. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice hardening. She must have heard something in his tone because her eyes sharpened, studying his face with new intensity. When she spoke this time, it was in heavily accented but clear English. "You saved me." "Yes," Thorne nodded. "From the river." She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the water that still lapped at the muddy shore just feet away. When she looked back at him, something had changed in her expression. A weight had settled there, as if she'd made some internal calculation and didn't like the result. "My name," she said carefully, "is Sana." "Sana," Thorne repeated, surprised by how naturally the name fit on his tongue. "That's a pretty name." She didn't smile, but something flickered in her dark eyes. "It means lightning." Looking at her now, the fierce intelligence in her gaze, the way she held herself. Despite her weakness, Thorne thought the name suited her perfectly. "Well, lightning," he said gently. "We need to get you somewhere warm and dry. You're going to catch your death out here in those wet clothes." She glanced down at herself, seeming to notice for the first time that her doe-skin dress was plastered to her body, her long hair dripping river water onto her shoulders. A shiver ran through her, though whether from cold or something else Thorne couldn't tell. "Where?" she asked. "My place isn't far," Thorne said, gesturing toward the ridge. "It's not much, but it's warm and dry. You can rest there until you're feeling stronger." Sana's eyes followed his gesture, then returned to his face. The wariness was back sharp and cutting. "You live alone?" "Yes." "Why, you help me?" It was such a simple question, but Thorne found himself struggling for an answer. Why had he helped her? Any sensible man in this territory would have been more cautious. Relations between the white settlers and the Apache had been tense for years, punctuated by raids and reprisals on both sides. Finding an Apache woman in the river could easily be seen as someone else's problem or even a trap. But looking at her now, bruised and shivering, Thorne couldn't imagine making any other choice. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "That's reason enough." Something shifted in her expression, surprise perhaps, or a cautious sort of hope. She studied his face for a long moment as if looking for deception, then nodded once. "I come," she said. Getting her onto dust proved more challenging than Thorne had anticipated. Sana was weak from her ordeal, her movements unsteady, but she was also proud. She refused his offer to lift her onto the horse. Instead, insisting on mounting herself. It took 3 attempts with Thorne steadying her. Each time she nearly fell before she managed to settle herself behind the saddle. "Hold on," he said, swinging up in front of her. Her hands gripped his belt tentatively, as if she wasn't sure touching him was appropriate. Thorne could feel the tremor in her fingers, whether from cold fear or simple exhaustion, he couldn't tell. The ride back to his ranch took nearly an hour, winding through narrow canyons and across sun-baked mesas. Sana said nothing during the journey, but Thorne could feel her growing tension as they rode deeper into the high country. This was white man's territory, now claimed and settled, fenced and branded. For an Apache woman, it might as well have been another world entirely. Thorne's ranch sat in a hidden valley protected on 3 sides by towering red cliffs and fed by a small spring that never ran dry. It wasn't much to look at: a simple adobe house, a barn, corrals for the horses and cattle, but it was home. More importantly, it was isolated. The nearest neighbor was over 50 miles away, which suited Thorne just fine. He'd had enough of people and their complications to last him several lifetimes. As they crested the final ridge and the valley opened up before them, Sana drew in a sharp breath. Her grip on his belt tightened. "This yours?" she asked. "Every acre," Thorne replied, then immediately wondered if that had been the wrong thing to say. To her people, the idea of owning land was probably foreign, maybe even offensive. But Sana said nothing, just continued to stare at the small ranch spread out below them as they descended into the valley. The house was cool and dim after the blazing afternoon sun. Thorne hadn't bothered with many amenities. The main room served as kitchen, dining room, and sitting area, with a large stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 smaller rooms opened off the main space: his bedroom and what had once been intended as a nursery but now served as storage for supplies and tools. Sana stood just inside the doorway, dripping river water onto his floor, taking in every detail with those sharp, dark eyes. Thorne realized how the place must look to her: sparse, rough, lacking any feminine touches that might have made it a home rather than simply a shelter. "The bedroom's there," he said, pointing to the closed door. "You can rest. Get out of those wet clothes. I'll find you something dry to wear." She looked at him sharply. "Your woman's clothes?" The question hit harder than he'd expected. "No," he said quietly. "There's no woman here. Hasn't been for a long time, but I've got some old shirts that should fit you well enough." Sana nodded, but she didn't move toward the bedroom. Instead, she remained standing in the center of the main room, water still dripping from her hair and dress, as if waiting for something. "What is it?" Thorne asked. "In river," she said slowly, "before you pull me out. Did you see others? Others. Men from my people. They—" She touched the bruise on her temple, wincing. "They put me in water." Thorne felt a cold rage building in his chest. "They tried to drown you. Is punishment?" she said, her voice flat and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing the weather. "For bringing shame to the tribe. What kind of shame could possibly justify—" "I refused marriage to Chief's son," Sana interrupted. "Said I would choose my own husband or have none at all. This was unacceptable." She spoke with the controlled calm of someone who had made peace with her fate, but Thorne could see the anger burning beneath the surface. Lightning indeed. "So they tried to kill you for it." "Not kill," she said, shaking her head. "Cast out. Put me in river to see if spirits would save me or let me die. If I live, I am no longer of the tribe. If I die—" She shrugged. "Problem is solved." "Jesus," Thorne breathed. "And you lived." "Yes," she met his eyes directly. "You pulled me out." There was something in the way she said it, a weight and significance, that Thorne didn't understand. But before he could ask, she swayed slightly on her feet, reminding him that she'd nearly died less than 2 hours ago. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get you dry and warm. You can tell me the rest later." This time she didn't protest when he guided her toward the bedroom. She moved slowly, like someone walking through deep water, and Thorne realized that shock was probably setting in. He helped her sit on the edge of the bed, then went to find suitable clothes. His old shirts were too big for her, but they were clean and dry. He also found a pair of wool socks and a blanket that would help ward off the chill. When he returned to the bedroom, Sana was sitting exactly where he'd left her, staring at her hands. "Here," he said, setting the clothes on the bed beside her. "These should help. I'll be in the other room. Call if you need anything." She looked up at him with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Why?" she asked again. "Why what? Why you help? I am Apache. You are white. My people and your people." She made a gesture that encompassed all the violence and mistrust that lay between their two worlds. Thorne considered the question seriously. It deserved an honest answer. "I don't know your people," he said finally, "and most of my people don't know me. All I know is that you needed help and I was able to give it. That's all that matters." She studied his face for a long moment, as if looking for deception or hidden motives. Finally, she nodded. "I will remember," she said. Thorne wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he left her to change in privacy. In the main room, he built up the fire and put coffee on to boil. His hands shook slightly as he worked reaction setting in from the morning's drama. He'd saved her life. That much was clear, but as he stood looking out the window at the peaceful valley, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that his own life had just changed in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. When Sana emerged from the bedroom 20 minutes later, she looked different. The wet, bedraggled woman he'd pulled from the river was gone. In her place stood someone who moved with quiet grace, despite her obvious exhaustion. His old shirt hung loose on her frame, the sleeves rolled up to reveal her slender wrists, but somehow she made it look elegant. Her long black hair was still damp, but she'd braided it back from her face, revealing the sharp architecture of her cheekbones and the proud line of her jaw. The bruise on her temple looked worse now, a purple-black bloom against her copper skin, but she carried herself as if it were a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame. "Better?" Thorne asked. "Yes, thank you." She moved to the fireplace, holding her hands out to the warmth. "Your clothes are kind gift. Keep them as long as you need to." She turned to look at him, and Thorne was struck again by the intelligence in her dark eyes. This was not a woman who missed much, he realized. She was reading him as carefully as he was reading her, making her own assessments and calculations. "I smell coffee," she said. "You want some might help warm you up from the inside?" "Yes." Thorne poured 2 cups of the strong black brew and handed one to her. She wrapped her fingers around the tin cup, inhaling the steam, and for a moment something almost like contentment crossed her features. "You make good coffee," she said after taking a sip. "Practice," Thorne replied. "When you live alone, you learn to make things the way you like them." "How long alone?" The question was asked casually, but Thorne sensed deeper currents beneath it. He considered deflecting, giving her some vague non-answer, but something about her directness demanded honesty in return. 3 years, he said, "since my wife and daughter died." Sana's eyes softened slightly. "How they die?" "Fever swept through the territory that summer, took a lot of folks." He stared into his coffee cup, remembering. "I was away driving cattle to market in Santa Fe. By the time I got back..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Even after 3 years, the guilt still sat in his chest, like a stone. If he'd been there, maybe he could have done something. Maybe he could have saved them the way he'd saved Sana today. "You blame yourself," she said. It wasn't a question. "Shouldn't I? Did Fever care if you were there or not?" The simple logic of the question cut through years of self-recrimination like a blade. Thorne looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "Probably not," he admitted. "Then blame is foolish thing, waste of good man's heart." They drank their coffee in companionable silence after that, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle in the pasture. Despite everything that had happened, the violence of her casting out the near drowning, finding herself in a stranger's home, Sana seemed remarkably calm. There was a stillness about her that Thorne found both impressive and slightly unnerving. "What will you do now?" he asked finally. She set down her empty cup and considered the question. "I do not know. I cannot return to my people. They have spoken. I am dead to them, but I am alive, so I must make new life. That's not easy out here, especially for a woman alone." "I am not helpless," she said, a sharp edge creeping into her voice. "I can hunt, I can track, I can survive in the wilderness. I am daughter of the desert." "I didn't mean to imply, but you are right," she interrupted, her tone softening. "Is dangerous for woman alone. White men would see Apache woman and think—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Thorne understood. A lone Apache woman would be seen as fair game by too many frontier roughnecks. "You could stay here," he heard himself say. The words surprised him almost as much as they seemed to surprise her. Where had that come from? He'd been living alone by choice, avoiding complications, steering clear of anything that might disturb the careful balance he'd built for himself. And now he was inviting an Apache woman, a stranger, to share his home here. She repeated, her dark eyes searching his face. "For a while," he clarified quickly, "until you figure out what you want to do, until you're stronger." Sana was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "You know what my people will say if they learn I live with white man. I thought you said you were dead to them." "Dead to tribe, yes. But Apache see everything, know everything. Word would spread. And what would they say? That by their law I belong to you now." Thorne nearly dropped his coffee cup. "What? You pulled me from water. You saved my life when spirits would have let me die. By old law, very old law, this makes you responsible for me, makes me—" She hesitated, as if searching for the right word in English. "Yours." "That's ridiculous," Thorne said immediately. "You don't belong to anyone. You're a free woman who makes her own choices." Something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of respect. "You say this," she said carefully, "but law is law. Apache law says one thing, white man's law says another. What law do we follow in this house?" It was a fair question, and one that went to the heart of the impossible situation they found themselves in. Thorne set down his cup and looked at her directly. "In this house," he said, "we follow the law of common decency. You're my guest for as long as you want to stay, nothing more and nothing less. You're free to leave any time you choose, and free to stay as long as you need to. No obligations, no ownership, no ancient laws, just two people helping each other through a difficult time." Sana studied his face intently, as if trying to determine whether he meant what he was saying. Finally, she nodded slowly. "This is good law," she said. "I think I will try it. Then it's settled. You'll stay." "For now," she agreed. "But Thorne Maddox, you should know. If Apache law finds us here, it will not matter what we choose to follow. Old ways are strong ways. They do not bend easily." Thorne felt a chill that had nothing to do with the afternoon air cooling outside. "Are you saying your people might come looking for you?" "Maybe, probably not. I am dead to them, remember, but if they hear I live with the man who pulled me from river," she shrugged, "then maybe they come to see if their law is being honored. And if it's not, then there will be trouble." Thorne absorbed this information, weighing it against his desire to help her and his need for the peaceful solitude he'd built for himself. Any sensible man would probably send her on her way right now before complications could take root. But looking at her sitting by his fire wearing his old shirt, her hair still damp from the river that had nearly claimed her life, Thorne knew he couldn't do it. Whatever consequences might come, he couldn't turn his back on someone who needed help. It went against everything he believed about what it meant to be human. "Then we'll deal with that trouble if it comes," he said. Sana smiled for the first time since he'd pulled her from the water, a small, careful expression that nonetheless transformed her entire face. "Yes," she said, "we will." As the sun began to set outside, painting the valley walls in shades of gold and crimson, Thorne realized that his quiet, solitary life had just come to an end. He'd pulled more than a drowning woman from the Rio Grande that morning. He'd pulled in change, complexity, and the possibility of consequences he couldn't yet imagine. But looking at Sana warming herself by his fire, safe and alive despite everything that had tried to destroy her, Thorne found he didn't regret his choice. Whatever came next, they would face it together. After all, some laws were worth breaking, and some people were worth saving, no matter what the cost. Outside, the desert wind began to whisper through the canyon walls, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But inside the small adobe house, two unlikely companions sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. Neither of them could have guessed that this was only the beginning, that forces were already in motion that would test not only their resolve, but the very foundations of the world they thought they understood, that the simple act of pulling a woman from a river would ultimately challenge everything they believed about law, justice, love, and the meaning of belonging to another person. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up the chimney and out into the vast New Mexico sky, where they disappeared among the first stars of evening like tiny messengers carrying news of change to the watching desert. And in the growing darkness beyond the valley, eyes that missed nothing began to take notice of the smoke rising from Thorne Maddox's chimney, and to wonder what or who had brought the hermit rancher back to life after 3 years of mourning solitude. The wheels of fate, once set in motion, are difficult to stop, and sometimes the simple act of saving a life can change the course of many others, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, until the consequences reached shores that seemed impossibly distant from where the first splash was made. In the small adobe house, Sana finished her second cup of coffee and glanced toward the window, where full darkness was settling over the land like a familiar blanket. Soon it would be time to decide where she would sleep, how they would navigate the intimate practicalities of sharing a living space, and what unspoken rules would govern their strange new arrangement. But for now, it was enough to be warm, to be safe, and to be alive, when by all rights she should have been floating face down toward the Gulf of Mexico, another casualty of the harsh justice of the frontier. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and decisions. Tonight, lightning had found sanctuary in the most unlikely place of all, in the home of a white rancher who believed that saving a life required no justification beyond simple human decency. If only it could remain that simple. If only the desert didn't have such a long memory and such an unforgiving way of collecting on old debts. The first week passed in a careful dance of boundaries and unspoken negotiations. Thorne had given Sana the bedroom, insisting he was comfortable sleeping on a bedroll by the fire. She had protested at first. It was his house, his bed, but he'd been firm about it, and eventually she'd accepted the arrangement with the grace of someone who understood that sometimes accepting kindness was its own form of generosity. They developed routines without discussing them. Thorne would rise before dawn to tend the animals and check the fences, returning to find coffee already brewing and something simple prepared for breakfast. Sana moved through his kitchen with surprising familiarity, though she cooked nothing like his late wife Mary had. Where Mary's meals had been hearty frontier fare beans and beef and cornbread, Sana prepared things Thorne had never tasted. Flat bread cooked on hot stones, wild greens gathered from places he'd never thought to look, meat seasoned with herbs that made his mouth water. "Where did you learn to find food like this?" he asked, one morning watching her return from a dawn-gathering expedition with her arms full of plants he couldn't identify. "Desert teaches those who listen," she replied, spreading her collection on the table. "This one good for headaches, this one stops bleeding, this one makes meat tender." She picked up a small purple flower. "And this one dreams come easier." Dreams, sleep dreams, the kind that rest the spirit. She glanced at him meaningfully. "You cry out at night sometimes. Bad dreams." Thorne felt heat rise in his face. "I'm sorry if I woke you." "Not wake me." I sleep light always is Apache way, but your dreams, they hurt you. He wanted to deny it, to deflect with humor, or change the subject entirely. But something about the way she looked at him direct, without judgment, made lying seem pointless. Sometimes the war comes back, he said quietly. Sometimes it's Mary and little Sarah. Sometimes it's all mixed up together. Sana nodded as if this made perfect sense. Dead speak loudest when heart is tired. This flower help quiet them. That night she brewed him a tea that tasted like earth and starlight. He slept deeper than he had in months, and when morning came, the familiar weight in his chest felt lighter somehow. "Thank you," he said over breakfast. "Is nothing. One person helps another, this is how it should be." But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. These small kindnesses were building something between them, a foundation of trust that neither had expected. Thorne found himself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire, to the way Sana listened with her whole body when he talked about the ranch, about his plans for the coming winter. And he loved listening to her stories about growing up Apache, the way children learned to read tracks before they could walk steady, how the old women could predict weather by the behavior of ants, the elaborate naming ceremonies that connected each person to their place in the natural world. "What does Sana mean exactly?" he asked one evening. "You said lightning, but is there more to it?" She smiled, that rare expression that transformed her face. "Full name is Sana Nish Kij, lightning that strikes twice, given because I was born during summer storm, and lightning hit same tree twice while my mother labored." "Lightning that strikes twice," Thorne mused. "That's supposed to be impossible. Many impossible things happen when person pays attention." The second week brought the first test of their fragile domestic peace. Thorne had ridden out to check the cattle in the far pasture when he spotted dust on the horizon riders approaching from the east. 3 of them moving fast across the desert floor. His blood chilled. It could be anyone, drifters, traders, neighboring ranchers he'd never met. But something about the purposeful way they rode toward his valley set off every warning bell in his head. He spurred dust hard, racing back toward the house. If these were Apache warriors coming to check on Sana's fate, he wanted to be there when they arrived. Whatever ancient laws they intended to invoke, he wouldn't let them face her alone. Sana must have spotted the riders too, because when Thorne thundered into the yard, she was standing in the doorway wearing her original dress, clean now, and mended but still recognizably Apache. Her face was composed, but Thorne could see the tension in the line of her shoulders. "Friends of yours?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "Maybe, or maybe not." She stepped out of the house, moving to stand beside him as the 3 riders crested the ridge and began their descent into the valley. As they drew closer, Thorne could see they were indeed Apache, 2 younger men, flanking an older warrior whose bearing spoke of authority. They rode with the easy confidence of men who had never doubted their right to go wherever they chose, to take whatever they deemed necessary. The older man raised his hand in greeting as they approached, but his dark eyes never left Sana's face. When they were close enough to speak without shouting, he called out something in Apache that sounded like both question and challenge. Sana's response was brief, her tone carefully neutral. The exchange continued for several minutes, with the 2 younger warriors occasionally interjecting comments that made their leader's expression grow progressively more stern. "What are they saying?" Thorne asked quietly. "They are asking if it is true that I live with the white man who pulled me from the river," Sana replied without taking her eyes off the mounted warriors. "I told them it is true." The older warrior spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. Whatever he'd said made Sana stiffen slightly. "And now," Thorne prompted, "now he says that by saving my life you have claimed responsibility for me. That Apache law is clear. The man who saves a woman from drowning owns her fate." She finally turned to look at Thorne. "He wants to know if you understand what this means." "Tell him I understand that you're a free woman who makes her own choices." Sana's eyes widened slightly. Thorne, tell him. She spoke to the warriors in Apache, her voice stronger now. The older man's expression darkened, and he replied with what was clearly a rebuke. The two younger men shifted in their saddles, hands moving closer to the weapons at their sides. He says you do not understand Apache ways, Sana translated. He says that white man's ignorance does not change ancient law, that I belong to you now, whether you claim me or not. And what did you tell him? I told him that the white man who saved me follows different law, that he says I am free. The older warrior spoke again, his tone growing heated. One of the younger men said something that made his companions laugh, a sound without warmth. What's funny? Thorne demanded. He says that if you do not understand what the spirits have given you, then perhaps you are not worthy to keep it. Sana's voice was tight with controlled emotion. He says that if you will not claim me properly, then perhaps I should be given to someone who will. Thorne felt anger flare in his chest, hot and dangerous. Tell him that nobody gives you to anyone. You're not property to be handed around. But before Sana could translate, the older warrior dismounted. His companions followed suit, and suddenly the dynamic shifted from conversation to confrontation. The leader walked closer, his bearing radiating the kind of quiet menace that came from a lifetime of being obeyed without question. He spoke directly to Thorne now, his English heavily accented but clear. I am Nayeli Gide, war chief of the Chiricahua. This woman was cast out by our law, given to the river spirits for judgment. You pulled her from water. By ancient law, older than white man's coming, she is yours now. You understand? I understand that your people tried to murder her for refusing an unwanted marriage, Thorne replied, letting steel creep into his voice. And I understand that she's under my protection now. Something flickered in the war chief's eyes, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of respect. Protection, yes, but more than protection. By law, she belongs to you. Is your responsibility to claim her proper way, make her true wife. This you will do. Now wait just a minute. Or, Nayeli Gide continued, raising his voice to override Thorne's objection. If you are not man enough to claim what spirits have given, then she comes with us. We find her proper husband among our people, young warrior who will not be afraid of woman with strong spirit. The threat hung in the air between them, like smoke from a grass fire. Thorne glanced at Sana, who was watching the exchange with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on its outcome. She stays here, Thorne said finally, as my guest for as long as she chooses. Guest, the war chief repeated as if tasting something bitter. This is not enough. Law requires more. Your law, Thorne said, not mine. Nayeli Gide studied him for a long moment, then turned to speak rapidly to Sana in Apache. Her responses were brief, her tone growing more clipped with each exchange. Finally, the war chief nodded as if some internal debate had been settled. She tells me you are a good man, he said to Thorne, that you ask nothing, demand nothing, treat her with respect. This is unusual. It's called common decency. Perhaps. But common or not, it does not change law. You have until winter moon to make decision. Claim her as wife with proper ceremony, proper recognition of what spirits have done. Or we come back and she leaves with us. And if she doesn't want to go, the war chief's smile was sharp as broken glass. Then you better hope you have claimed her proper way by then, because Apache woman belongs somewhere. If not with man who saved her, then with tribe who will find her new place. He remounted his horse, his companions following suit. But before wheeling away, he called out something else to Sana, a long string of Apache that made her face go pale. What did he say? Thorne asked as the riders disappeared over the ridge. Sana was quiet for a long moment, staring at the dust cloud their departure had left hanging in the still air. He said that winter moon is 3 months away, she said finally, and that if you have not claimed me by then, he will give me to his nephew, a young warrior known for breaking horses and women with equal skill. Jesus Christ. He also said that the law is the law and that fighting it will only bring pain to both of us. Thorne felt the careful peace they'd built over the past 2 weeks crumbling around him like a house built on sand. "Sana, I'm sorry. I never meant for—" "You did nothing wrong," she interrupted, finally meeting his eyes. "You saved life that was forfeit. But in saving it, you became responsible for what happens to it next. That's insane, is law. Very old law from time when tribes were smaller, when every life was precious and could not be wasted." She walked toward the house, then paused at the doorway. "Among my people, marriage is not always about love, Thorne Maddox. Sometimes it is about survival. Sometimes it is about honor, and sometimes it is about keeping women safe from men who would break her." That evening they sat by the fire in tense silence. Thorne stared into the flames, wrestling with the impossible situation they'd found themselves in. 3 months. 3 months to decide whether to enter into a marriage neither of them had asked for, or watch Sana be dragged away to face a fate that might be worse than death. "Tell me about your nephew," he said finally. Sana looked up from the moccasin she was mending. "Nyaligide's nephew, yes. His name is Hataliga. It means angry bear." She set down her sewing, her expression growing distant. "He is strong warrior, good hunter, but he drinks white man's whiskey when he can get it, and when he drinks, he becomes violent. His first wife died of injuries after falling downhill. His second wife ran away and was never seen again. And they want to give you to him. If you do not claim me first, yes." Thorne felt sick. The idea of this woman, intelligent, proud, kind, being handed over to some drunken brute who might beat her to death, made his blood boil. There has to be another way. "What way? I cannot return to my people as unmarried woman. I have been cast out. I cannot live alone in wilderness, too dangerous, especially with winter coming, and I cannot stay here as your guest. If Apache law says I belong to you, why not? It's my house, my land. I'll tell anyone who asks that you're under my protection." Sana shook her head. "You do not understand. If Nayeli Gide says I belong to you, then every Apache warrior will know this. And if you refuse to claim me proper way, they will see this as insult to their law, their ways. They will come, Thorne. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next week, but they will come. And when they do—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Thorne could imagine what a war party might do to a white rancher who had insulted Apache law and stolen one of their women, even a cast-out woman. "So what are you saying, that we have to get married to keep you safe?" "I am saying that sometimes there is no good choice, only less bad one." Thorne stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The peaceful valley that had been his refuge for 3 years suddenly felt like a trap. "I can't ask you to do that," he said quietly. "To marry a stranger just to avoid being given to someone worse. You are not asking. I am telling you what choices we have. There has to be something else, some other way. Perhaps." Sana's voice was carefully neutral. "Tell me, Thorne Maddox, why is idea of marrying me so terrible?" He turned from the window, startled by the direct question. "It's not that it's terrible, it's just, it wouldn't be real. It would be a convenience, a legal fiction to satisfy your war chief's demands. And this is bad thing, isn't it? Don't you want more than that? Don't you deserve more?" Sana was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the flickering firelight. "What I deserve and what I can have are not same thing. 3 weeks ago I was cast into river to die. Now I sit in warm house, drink good coffee, share meals with man who treats me with kindness. Perhaps this is more than I deserve already." "Don't say that. Don't ever say that." "Why? Because you think I am worth more than survival and kindness?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to explore. Thorne found himself looking at her, really looking for the first time since he'd pulled her from the river. The bruise on her temple had faded to a pale yellow shadow, and her face had filled out slightly with regular meals and rest. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not just attractive in an exotic way, but genuinely beautiful, with intelligent eyes and a mouth that seemed designed for both laughter and serious conversation. When had he stopped seeing her as a problem to be solved and started seeing her as a woman? Yes, he said quietly. I think you're worth more than just survival. Something shifted in her expression, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of hope. Then perhaps marriage would not be such a terrible thing. Perhaps it could be beginning of something neither of us expected. Sana, I know you still grieve your wife, she said gently. I do not ask you to forget her or to love me as you loved her. But perhaps two people who are alone can be less alone together. Perhaps kindness can grow into something deeper, given time. Thorne felt something tight in his chest beginning to loosen. For 3 years, he'd been frozen in grief, unable to imagine a future that didn't revolve around loss. But looking at Sana now, seeing the careful hope in her dark eyes, he wondered if maybe healing was possible after all. It wouldn't be fair to you, he said. My heart, it's been broken pretty thoroughly. I don't know if I have enough left to offer anyone. Broken things can be mended, Sana replied. Sometimes they are even stronger after healing. Before Thorne could respond, a new sound drifted across the valley, the distant lowing of cattle in distress. He froze, listening intently. There it was again, along with something else. The sound of horses moving fast through the darkness. Someone's out there, he said, reaching for his rifle. Sana was already on her feet, moving toward the window. How many? Can't tell. Could be rustlers, could be... He paused, struck by a terrible thought. Could be your war chief's nephew come to see what he's inheriting. Atali Ga would not come alone, and he would not come at night, like thief. Then who? Their question was answered by a gunshot, echoing across the valley, followed by the panicked bellow of frightened cattle. Someone was definitely out there, and they weren't friendly visitors. Stay in the house, Thorne said, checking his ammunition. No. Sana's voice was firm. If there is trouble, we face it together. Sana, if something happens to you, then you will have failed to protect what Apache law says belongs to you, she interrupted, and that failure will bring War Chief and all his warriors down on this valley like summer storm. Better we stand together now. She had a point, though Thorne hated admitting it. If anything happened to her while she was under his protection, he'd have more to worry about than rustlers or drifters. Another gunshot cracked across the night air, closer this time. Whoever was out there was moving toward the house. All right, Thorne said grimly, but you stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. They slipped out into the darkness together, moving cautiously toward the sound of the disturbance. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see by, but also making them visible to anyone watching from the shadows. As they crested a low rise overlooking the main pasture, Thorne could see 3 riders silhouetted against the sky, hazing a small group of his cattle toward the valley's mouth. Rustlers then, but operating with unusual boldness. Most cattle thieves preferred to work in complete darkness, taking animals from remote pastures where the theft might not be discovered for days, unless they wanted to be discovered. It's a trap, he breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. What? They're not trying to steal cattle. They're trying to draw us out, get us away from the house. Even as he spoke, Thorne was scanning the darkness around them, looking for signs of other riders. The question is why? His answer came in the form of a rifle muzzle pressed against the back of his neck. Because Hataliga wants to meet the woman who belongs to him, a voice said in accented English. Thorne started to turn, but the rifle barrel dug harder into his neck. Beside him, Sana had gone perfectly still, her breathing barely audible. You are Thorne Maddox, the voice continued, the white man who thinks he can ignore Apache law. And you're the drunk who beats women, Thorne replied evenly, a harsh laugh. Ah, she has told you about me. Good. Then you know why I am here. You're 3 months early. Perhaps I grew impatient to meet my new wife." Slowly, carefully, Thorne turned around. The man behind him was younger than he'd expected. Maybe 30, with the lean build of a warrior who lived on horseback. But there was something in his eyes, even in the moonlight, that spoke of violence held barely in check. "She's not your wife," Thorne said. "According to your own law, she belongs to me until I decide otherwise." Hataligah's smile was sharp and predatory. "And what have you decided, white man?" It was the moment of truth, Thorne realized. Whatever he said now would determine not just Sana's fate, but the course of everything that followed. He could try to maintain his position that she was his guest under his protection, but not his property. Or he could claim her according to Apache law, making her his wife, in fact, if not yet, in ceremony. He looked at Sana, saw the carefully controlled fear in her dark eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of the man with the rifle. Fear of being dragged away to a life of brutality and degradation. "I've decided she stays with me," Thorne said firmly, "as my wife." Hataligah's expression darkened. "You have not performed proper ceremony. You have not asked permission of war chief. These words mean nothing. Then we'll have the ceremony, we'll get the permission, but she stays with me." For a long moment, the Apache warrior studied Thorne's face, as if looking for weakness or deception. Finally, he lowered his rifle slightly. "You would fight for her, yes. You would die for her." Thorne thought about it for exactly 2 seconds. "Yes. Even though she is Apache, especially because she's Apache. Because that means she's strong enough to survive anything, smart enough to make her own choices, and brave enough to face whatever comes next." Something flickered in Hataligah's eyes, surprise perhaps, or the beginning of grudging respect. He glanced at Sana, then back at Thorne. "Nayeli Gide said you were different," he said finally, "that you treated her as person, not as thing to be owned." I did not believe him, and now I think perhaps the spirits chose well when they put you by river that day. He shouldered his rifle, and Thorne felt tension. He hadn't even realized he was carrying drain from his shoulders. "But words are easy, white man. Actions are what matter. You have 2 months to prove you mean what you say." 2 months. Winter moon comes early this year. Old women say it in bones, in way birds fly south. You want this woman as wife, you perform ceremony before first snow. Make it right with Apache law. Or I come back, and next time there will be no talking. He whistled sharply, and the riders in the distance ceased their cattle harassment, wheeling their horses toward the valley's exit. Within minutes, they had melted back into the darkness from which they'd come, leaving Thorne and Sana alone with their racing hearts and the echo of ultimatums. "Well," Sana said after a long moment, "that could have gone worse." Thorne let out a shaky laugh. "How do you figure? He could have shot you and taken me tonight. Instead, he gave us 2 months to make this real." "Is that what we're doing? Making it real?" She turned to face him fully, her expression serious in the moonlight. "Thorne Maddox, when you told him I was your wife, did you mean it?" It was a fair question, and one he'd been avoiding asking himself. But standing there in the darkness with the memory of Hataligah's rifle still fresh against his neck, Thorne found the answer coming easier than he'd expected. "Yes," he said, "I think I did." "Then we have much to discuss before winter moon." As they walked back toward the house, Thorne found himself thinking about the strange turns his life had taken. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a hermit rancher content with his solitude and his grief. Now he was contemplating marriage to an Apache woman he'd known for less than a month, trying to navigate laws and customs he barely understood, and facing the very real possibility of a war that could destroy everything he'd built. But looking at Sana walking beside him, seeing the way moonlight caught in her dark hair and the determined set of her shoulders, Thorne realized he wasn't afraid of the changes coming. For the first time in 3 years, he was looking forward to something. For the first time since Mary and Sarah had died, he could imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by loss. Maybe that was worth fighting for. Maybe that was worth risking everything for. Maybe lightning could strike twice after all. The conversation they needed to have waited until the next evening, hanging between them all day, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Thorne went through the motions of ranch work, checking fences, moving cattle to fresh pasture, repairing a section of roof that had been damaged in the last windstorm, but his mind kept circling back to the words he'd spoken in the darkness. She stays with me, as my wife. Had he meant them? The question followed him through every task, every quiet moment when his hands were busy but his thoughts were free to wander. When he'd pulled Sana from the river 3 weeks ago, marriage had been the furthest thing from his mind. He'd been focused on survival, hers first, then his own, as he'd gradually realized the complications her presence might bring. But somehow in the space between saving her life and facing down Hataliga's rifle, something fundamental had shifted. Sana seemed equally preoccupied, moving through her daily routines with the careful precision of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. She prepared their meals with her usual quiet efficiency, tended the small garden she'd started behind the house, mended clothes that didn't really need mending. But Thorne caught her watching him when she thought he wasn't looking, her dark eyes thoughtful and assessing. They were learning each other, he realized. Not just their habits and preferences, but the deeper currents that moved beneath the surface of their carefully polite interactions. The way she hummed softly to herself when she cooked a melody he didn't recognize but found strangely comforting. The way she always paused at the window each evening as the sun set, facing west, toward the mountains where her people lived. The way she touched the small medicine pouch at her throat whenever she was nervous or deep in thought, and she was learning him too. How he favored his left shoulder where an old war wound still ached on cold mornings. How he always checked the horizon 3 times before settling in for the evening, a habit born of too many nights when danger had come from unexpected directions. How he sometimes stood at Mary and Sarah's graves for long minutes without speaking, not praying exactly, but acknowledging their presence in his life, even though they were gone. When the sun finally set and they'd finished their supper, Thorne built up the fire and poured 2 cups of coffee. Sana took hers without comment, settling into what had become her usual spot on the low bench he'd built near the hearth. The familiar ritual felt different tonight, weighted with unspoken questions and the memory of promises made under duress. "We should talk," Thorne said finally. "Yes." Sana's voice was steady, but he could see tension in the line of her shoulders. "We should. About last night. About what I said to Hataliga. You said I was your wife." "I did." Thorne stared into his coffee cup, searching for the right words. "The question is whether I meant it, or whether I was just trying to keep him from dragging you away." Sana was quiet for a long moment, considering. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "Does it matter?" The words were spoken. Apache law will hold you to them, whether you meant them or not. "It matters to me, and I think it matters to you too." She looked at him, then her dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes, it matters to me. So tell me what you're thinking about all of this, about us." Sana set down her coffee cup and clasped her hands in her lap. Thorne had noticed she did this when she was preparing to say something important, as if she needed to anchor herself before diving into deep waters. "I think," she said slowly, "that 3 weeks ago the spirits put us both by that river for reasons we do not yet understand. I think that saving my life changed your life in ways you did not expect. And I think that perhaps this is not accident. You believe in fate. I believe in patterns, in the way things connect to other things, like streams joining river, like seasons following seasons. My grandmother used to say that the spirits do not waste motion. Every action has purpose even when we cannot see it." Thorne considered this. "And what purpose do you think this serves? You nearly drowning me, finding you all the complications that followed. Maybe the purpose is not yet finished revealing itself." That's not really an answer. Sana smiled slightly. Apache women are not always direct as white men prefer. We understand that some truths take time to unfold like flowers opening to sun. All right then, let me be direct enough for both of us. Are you willing to marry me? Not because Apache law demands it, not because it's the safest choice available, but because you think we might actually build something together. The directness of the question seemed to surprise her. She studied his face for a long moment as if looking for something she wasn't sure she'd find. I will answer your direct question with direct answer, she said finally, but first you must answer mine. Why do you want to marry a Apache woman you have known for 3 weeks? Is it only to protect me from Hataliga, only to avoid trouble with War Chief, or is there something else? Thorne had been dreading this question, partly because he wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. He thought about deflecting, giving her some comfortable half-truth that would satisfy the immediate need for conversation without requiring him to examine his own motives too closely. But looking at her sitting by his fire wearing his old shirt, like it belonged to her, her hair loose around her shoulders, in a way that made her seem both vulnerable and strong, he found he couldn't lie to her. At first it was just about protecting you, he said honestly. You needed help and I was able to give it. That seemed like reason enough. And now, he paused, struggling to put complex feelings into simple words. Now I look forward to seeing you in the morning. I like the way you make coffee, the way you've started a garden without asking permission, the way you listen when I talk about things I haven't shared with anyone in years. I like the sound of your voice, the way you move through my house, like you belong there. These are good reasons, Sana said softly, but they're not love. I want to be honest about that. What I felt for Mary, that deep, settled certainty that she was my other half, I don't know if I can feel that again. I don't know if I have that left in me. And you think I expect this from you. Don't you deserve that kind of love from whoever you marry? Sana was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. When I was girl, maybe 16 summers, I thought I knew what love was. There was young warrior, strong, handsome, good hunter. He would bring me gifts, flowers, pretty stones from the river. He spoke of marriage, of the life we would build together. She paused, her expression growing distant. But when raiders came and burned our winter camp, when food grew scarce and people began to die, his love proved thin. He chose another girl, one whose family had more horses, more influence. Love, I learned, can be a fragile thing when tested by hardship. So you stopped believing in it. I stopped expecting it to be enough by itself. Love without respect, without partnership, without the willingness to stand together when trouble comes. This is just pretty words that disappear when wind blows hard. Thorne felt something shift in his understanding. And what I'm offering, companionship, partnership, mutual respect, you think that might be more valuable than romantic love. I think it might be better foundation to build on. Love can grow from respect and shared purpose. But respect and partnership without love, this can still make good marriage, good life. And if love never comes, Sana met his eyes directly, then we will have honesty and kindness and the satisfaction of facing whatever comes together instead of alone. This is more than many marriages have, white or Apache. Thorne found himself thinking about his marriage to Mary. It had been a love match. Certainly he'd been completely smitten with her from their first meeting at a church social in Kansas. But their life together had been built on more than just romantic feeling. They'd been partners in the truest sense, working together to build their homestead, supporting each other through the inevitable hardships of frontier life. The love had been important, but it had been the partnership that had made their marriage strong. So your answer is yes, he asked. You're willing to try this? My answer is that I think we are already trying this, Sana replied. We have been living as partners for 3 weeks, sharing meals and work and conversation. Adding ceremony and legal recognition would not change day-to-day life very much. but it would make us safe, both of us, from those who would use Apache law to cause trouble. When you put it like that, it sounds almost practical. Sometimes practical is good thing. Sometimes practical lasts longer than passion. Thorne stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the star-filled desert sky. The valley looked peaceful in the moonlight, but he knew that peace was temporary. Whether they married or not, change was coming. The question was whether they would face it together or separately. "There's something else we need to discuss," he said without turning around. "The ceremony itself. I don't know anything about Apache wedding customs." "Is not complicated," Sana said, "but it must be done properly, or Nayeli Gide will not recognize it as valid. What does properly involve? Both of us must consent freely before witnesses. There must be exchange of gifts to show respect for each other's families, and—" She hesitated, as if unsure how he would react to what came next. And we must share dwelling as husband and wife, not as guest and host." Thorne felt heat rise in his face as the implications sank in. For the past 3 weeks he'd been sleeping by the fire while she took the bedroom, maintaining a careful distance that had allowed them both to pretend their arrangement was temporary and uncomplicated. Marriage would change that fundamental dynamic. "I see," he said carefully. "This troubles you." Thorne turned from the window to find her watching him with that direct gaze that seemed to see straight through whatever walls he tried to maintain. "It doesn't trouble me," he said honestly, "but it complicates things." "In what way?" "Sana, I'm attracted to you. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. But I don't want you to feel like marriage means you owe me anything you're not freely willing to give. Physical intimacy should be a choice, not an obligation." Something softened in her expression. "You think I do not know this? You think because I am a Apache woman who has been cast out, I do not understand difference between choice and duty. I think you're a woman who's been through hell, who's facing limited options, and who might feel pressured to agree to things she wouldn't choose under different circumstances." Sana stood up, moving closer to where he stood by the window. In the moonlight, her face was luminous, her dark eyes serious but not afraid. "Thorne Maddox," she said quietly. "Do you think I am weak woman who cannot speak her own mind? No, definitely not. Do you think I am foolish woman who does not understand consequences of choices? No. Then trust me to know my own heart, my own desires. Trust me to tell you what I want and what I do not want, and to expect you to listen." She was close enough now that he could smell the sage and soap scent of her hair, close enough to see the pulse beating in the hollow of her throat, close enough to kiss if he dared. "And what do you want?" he asked, his voice rougher than he'd intended. "I want partnership built on honesty. I want marriage that protects us both from those who would use old laws to cause new pain. And I want to see what happens when two people who respect each other share more than just meals and conversation." "Sana, I am not asking you to love me," she said, placing her hand flat against his chest. "I am asking you to be honest with me, to treat me as equal partner, and to let whatever happens between us grow naturally from who we are together." Thorne covered her hand with his own, feeling the warmth of her palm through his shirt. Such a simple touch, but it sent electricity racing through his nervous system. "I can do that," he said quietly. "Then we have understanding." "I suppose we do." But even as he said it, Thorne realized that understanding was only the beginning. Between agreeing to marriage and actually creating a life together lay a wilderness of unknowns. They would need to navigate not just Apache law and white man's customs, but their own complicated feelings about intimacy, partnership, and what it meant to build something new from the ashes of what they'd lost. The next morning brought the first tangible step toward making their agreement reality. Thorne rode into the small town of Esperanza, 20 miles east of his ranch, to speak with Father Miguel at the Catholic mission. If they were going to satisfy both Apache law and territorial law, They'd need both traditional ceremony and legal documentation. Father Miguel was a practical man who'd been serving the spiritual needs of the territory's diverse population for nearly 2 decades. He'd married Mexican vaqueros to Irish immigrant women, performed funeral services for Apache chiefs, and baptized children who belonged to 3 different cultures. Very little surprised him anymore. An Apache woman, he said thoughtfully, when Thorne explained the situation, cast out by her tribe, saved from drowning now to be married under both Apache and Christian law. That's the situation. And you love her. Thorne considered lying, giving the priest the romantic answer he probably expected. But something about Father Miguel's weathered face and knowing eyes suggested that honesty would be better received. I respect her. I care about her welfare. I believe we could build a good life together. Ah. Father Miguel nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Sometimes the best marriages begin with respect and grow into love rather than the reverse. Love without respect is passion that burns out quickly. Respect without love is foundation that can support whatever grows upon it. So you'll perform the ceremony. I will need to speak with her first to ensure she consents freely. But assuming that is the case, yes. When would you like to be married? Before the first snow, before the winter moon is full. That gives us perhaps 6 weeks, time enough to prepare properly. The priest made a note in the ledger book where he recorded all the significant events in his parishioners' lives. Will there be Apache witnesses? I'm not sure, probably not. For the marriage to be recognized by her people, there should be Apache witnesses. Otherwise, they may claim the ceremony was not valid. Thorne felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach. Every solution seemed to create new problems, new complications to navigate. Do you know any Apache who might be willing to serve as witnesses? Father Miguel smiled. As it happens, I do. There is a family, the Naranos, who live near the mission. They were cast out from their tribe many years ago for converting to Christianity, but they have maintained some of the old ways. They might be willing to help, especially if I explain the circumstances. That would be incredibly helpful. Consider it done. But Senor Maddox, there is something else we must discuss. Marriage is not just ceremony. It is commitment to shared life, to supporting each other through whatever comes. Are you prepared for the challenges that marrying across cultures might bring? Thorne thought about Hataliga's rifle pressed against his neck, about War Chief Nayeli Gide's ultimatums, about the delicate balance he and Sana were trying to maintain between 2 different worlds. I'm not sure anyone can be prepared for those challenges, he said honestly, but I'm willing to face them. That is good answer. And Senor, the woman's name is Sana. Yes, Sana Nish Kish, lightning that strikes twice. Father Miguel's eyebrows rose. An auspicious name. In my experience, lightning that strikes twice is either very good fortune or very bad fortune. There is rarely anything in between. The ride back to the ranch gave Thorne time to think about the priest's words. Very good fortune or very bad fortune. Looking at the situation objectively, it was hard to tell which direction things were heading. On one hand, he was entering into marriage with a woman he barely knew, taking on responsibilities and complications that could easily destroy the peaceful life he'd built for himself. On the other hand, for the first time in 3 years, he felt genuinely hopeful about the future. Sana was waiting for him when he arrived home, working in the garden she'd expanded without asking permission. She'd somehow managed to coax vegetables from the hard desert soil squash and beans and peppers that thrived in the hot, dry climate. Watching her move between the rows, checking each plant with the careful attention of someone who understood that food was never something to be taken for granted. Thorne felt a surge of admiration for her resilience. "How did it go?" she asked, straightening up as he dismounted. "Better than expected. Father Miguel will marry us, but he wants to speak with you first to make sure you're consenting freely." "Of course. When?" "Tomorrow, if you're willing to make the ride into town." Sana nodded. And witnesses, he thinks he can arrange Apache witnesses. A family that was cast out years ago but still understands the old ways. This is good news. But something in her tone suggested she wasn't entirely pleased. What's wrong? She was quiet for a moment, brushing dirt from her hands. Nothing is wrong exactly. But speaking with priest, having Apache witnesses, this makes it real in a way that talking by fireplace does not. Are you having second thoughts? Not second thoughts, but... She paused as if searching for the right words. When I was girl, I used to dream about my wedding day. The dress my mother would make, the songs the women would sing, the celebration that would last for days. All the ways my people would welcome me into new stage of life. Thorne felt a pang of guilt. In focusing on the practical necessities satisfying Apache law, avoiding conflict with Hataliga, he'd forgotten that this was supposed to be a celebration, a joyful beginning rather than just a political solution. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't think about what kind of wedding you might have wanted. Is not your fault. I am woman without people now. I cannot have wedding of my girlhood dreams. But we could make it special in other ways. We could have a celebration here, invite Father Miguel and the witness family for a meal. You could wear something beautiful. I could ride to Santa Fe, find you a proper dress. Sana looked at him with surprise. You would do this? Of course, just because we're marrying for practical reasons doesn't mean it can't be a happy occasion. Something shifted in her expression, a warmth that hadn't been there before. This is very kind thought, but I do not need white woman's dress. I have something that will do. Are you sure? Very sure, but Thorne, the fact that you offered, that you thought about my feelings, this means much to me. That evening they sat by the fire planning their wedding with the same practical attention they'd given to every other aspect of their unusual courtship. They would be married in 6 weeks on a Saturday when both the priest and the Apache witnesses could be present. The ceremony would take place at the mission, followed by a celebration at the ranch. It would be small, perhaps a dozen people at most, but it would be theirs. There's one more thing, Sana said as they prepared for bed, about the marriage ceremony itself. Apache tradition requires that we both speak our intentions clearly before witnesses, not just promise to be husband and wife, but explain why we choose this path. What kind of explanation? Truth. Why we believe this marriage will be good for both of us, why we choose each other over all other possibilities. It does not have to be long speech, but it must be honest. Thorne considered this. The idea of publicly declaring his feelings such as they were felt uncomfortably exposing. But then again, everything about this situation required him to step outside his comfort zone. I can do that, he said. Good. And Thorne, yes. When you speak your intentions, remember that Apache people value directness. They will respect honest words more than pretty ones. As they settled into their respective sleeping arrangements, Thorne by the fire, Sana in the bedroom, both were quiet with their own thoughts. In 6 weeks, these careful boundaries would dissolve. They would share not just living space, but intimate space, not just conversation, but physical closeness. They would become, in the eyes of both their peoples, truly married. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. Thorne lay on his bedroll, staring at the dying embers of the fire, wondering what kind of husband he would be to a woman he was still learning to understand. Would he be able to give her the partnership she deserved? Could he protect her from the various forces, both human and legal, that might threaten their unconventional union? In the bedroom, Sana was wrestling with her own uncertainties. She'd been honest when she'd told Thorne that she didn't expect love from their marriage. But lying in the darkness, listening to him settle for sleep in the next room, she found herself hoping for it anyway. Not the desperate, consuming passion of her girlhood fantasies, but something deeper and more sustainable. The kind of love that grew from shared work and mutual respect, from facing hardships together and choosing each other again and again. 6 weeks. It seemed like both an eternity and no time at all. The next morning brought their first real test as an engaged couple. Thorne was checking the horses in the corral when dust lifted her head, ears pricked toward the eastern ridge. A moment later, he could see what had caught her attention, a rider approaching at a steady pace still too far away to identify. "Sana," he called toward the house. "We've got company coming." She appeared in the doorway, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "One rider. Looks like it. Apache or white. Can't tell yet." As the rider drew closer, Thorne could see it was a white man, middle-aged and well-dressed despite the dust of hard travel. He sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to respect and obedience. When he was close enough to speak, he raised his hand in greeting. "You Thorne Maddox," he called out. "I am. What can I do for you?" "Name's Coleman, Jim Coleman. I'm the territorial Indian agent for this district." He dismounted, tying his horse to the corral fence. "I understand you've been harboring an Apache woman." Thorne felt his stomach drop. Of all the complications he'd anticipated, interference from the territorial government hadn't been high on the list. "Miss Sana is my guest," he said carefully. "Your guest." Coleman looked skeptical. "How long has she been your guest, Mr. Maddox?" "About a month." "And in that time, have there been any incidents, any contact with hostile Apache?" The memory of Hataliga's rifle flashed through Thorne's mind, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of contact are you referring to, Mr. Coleman? The kind that ends with dead cattle, burned buildings, and white settlers running for their lives?" Coleman's tone was sharp, with barely controlled irritation. "I've got reports of Apache warriors moving through this area, Mr. Maddox. Some folks think they might be looking for something or someone they've lost." Before Thorne could respond, Sana stepped out of the house. She'd taken time to braid her hair and put on her original dress, the one she'd been wearing when he'd pulled her from the river. She looked every inch the Apache woman, proud and unmistakably Indian. Coleman's hand dropped instinctively toward his sidearm before he caught himself. "You must be Sana." "I am. Do you mind if I ask how you came to be living with Mr. Maddox here?" Sana glanced at Thorne, a quick look that asked permission to speak freely. When he nodded, she turned back to the Indian agent. "He saved my life," she said simply. "I was drowning in the Rio Grande. He pulled me out. And you've been here ever since?" "Yes. By choice or because you're being held against your will?" Thorne felt anger flare, but Sana answered before he could object to the implication. "By choice. Thorne Maddox has never held me against my will. He has given me shelter, food, protection. I am free to leave whenever I choose." Coleman studied her face as if trying to determine whether she was telling the truth or had been coached. "And do you choose to leave?" "No, I choose to stay." "Why?" "Because this is my home now." The simple declarion hung in the air between them. Coleman looked from Sana to Thorne and back again, clearly trying to piece together the dynamics of their relationship. "Mr. Maddox," he said finally, "are you aware of the legal complexities of harboring an Apache woman? Are you aware of the potential consequences? What consequences would those be?" "Well, for starters, if she's a fugitive from tribal justice." "She's not a fugitive," Thorne interrupted. "She was cast out by her tribe, exiled. She has as much right to live where she chooses as anyone else." "That may be your interpretation, but tribal law and territorial law don't always align. And if her presence here is attracting hostile Apache, has anyone actually been hurt?" Thorne asked. "Have any settlers been attacked? Any property destroyed?" Coleman was forced to admit that there hadn't been any actual violence. But the potential exists, and as Indian agent, it's my responsibility to prevent conflicts before they start. "Then maybe you should focus on the people who are causing the problems, not the woman who's trying to escape them." "Is that what you're doing, Miss Sana, escaping problems?" Again, Sana answered with calm directness. "I am building new life, here with man who treats me with respect. And what happens if your tribal leaders decide they want you back? They have already decided. I am dead to them. This cannot be changed." Coleman looked frustrated by her matter-of-fact responses. Clearly, he'd been hoping to find evidence of coercion or illegal activity, something that would justify removing Sana from the situation and eliminating what he saw as a potential flashpoint for conflict. "Mr. Maddox," he said, trying a different approach. "I'm going to be frank with you. Having an Apache woman living on your ranch is going to attract attention. Some of it might be unwelcome attention. Are you prepared to deal with the consequences?" "What consequences specifically?" "Well, if Apache warriors come looking for her, they already have," Thorne said, deciding that honesty might be more effective than evasion, "and we resolved the situation peacefully." Coleman's eyebrows shot up. "They came here why wasn't I notified?" "Because there was nothing to notify you about. They came, we talked, they left. No one was hurt." "What did they want?" Thorne glanced at Sana, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. "They wanted to make sure I understood Apache law regarding the woman I'd saved from drowning. And do you understand it?" "I understand it well enough." "Which means what exactly?" Thorne took a deep breath, knowing that what he said next would fundamentally change how the territorial government viewed his situation. "It means Miss Sana and I are going to be married." The announcement hit Coleman like a physical blow. He actually took a step backward, his face cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally a kind of horrified fascination. "Married," he repeated. "Yes, to an Apache woman. To the woman I love," Thorne corrected, and was surprised to realize that somewhere in the past few weeks it had become true. Coleman looked between them, clearly struggling to process this development. "Mr. Maddox, are you aware of the social implications of what you're proposing? The potential backlash from the white community? Are you aware that it's none of your business who I choose to marry? Actually, it is my business when it involves Indian-white relations in my district. This kind of union could be seen as legitimizing Apache presence in areas where they're not welcome." "Sana isn't representing Apache interests," Thorne said, his voice growing hard. "She's not a diplomat or a spy or a political symbol. She's a woman who nearly died and is trying to build a new life. If you've got a problem with that, Mr. Coleman, I suggest you examine your own assumptions about what makes a person worthy of basic human dignity." The rebuke clearly stung. Coleman's face flushed red, but he didn't back down. "Mr. Maddox, I'm trying to prevent a situation that could spiral into violence. Mixed marriages, especially involving Apache, are legal under territorial law," Sana interrupted quietly. "I have checked this with priest in Esperanza. There is no law against Apache woman marrying white man, only prejudice." Coleman turned to her, his expression shifting from frustration to something approaching genuine curiosity. "You speak English very well. I was taught by missionary when I was child, before my people decided Christianity was poison that would destroy Apache ways. And yet you're willing to marry a white man and live according to white customs. I am willing to marry good man and live according to customs that allow me to be safe and free," Sana corrected. "Color of skin matters less than content of heart." Thorne felt a surge of pride at her response. She was handling Coleman's questioning with far more grace than he probably would have managed in her position. Coleman stood quietly for a moment, apparently weighing his options. Finally, he sighed and shook his head. "Mr. Maddox, Miss Sana, I can't say I approve of your decision, and I can't promise that other territorial officials will be as understanding as I'm trying to be. But you're right that there's no law preventing your marriage. Just—" He paused, struggling for words. "Just be careful. Be very careful. There are people on both sides who won't be happy about this union, and some of them might try to express their displeasure in violent ways." "We understand the risks," Thorne said. "I hope you do." Coleman untied his horse and swung into the saddle. "For what it's worth, I hope things work out for you, both of you. But if there's trouble, any kind of trouble, you contact me immediately. Don't try to handle it yourselves." After Coleman rode away, Thorne and Sana stood in the yard watching until he disappeared over the eastern ridge. "Well," Sana said finally, "that could have gone worse." "How do you figure?" "He could have tried to arrest me, or you. Instead, he just warned us to be careful." "Small comfort is comfort nonetheless." She turned to look at him, her expression serious. "Thorne, when you told him we were going to be married, when you said you loved me, did you mean those words?" Thorne realized that somewhere during Coleman's interrogation, his feelings had crystallized into something he could finally name. Not the desperate passion he'd felt for Mary, but something steadier and perhaps more mature. "Yes," he said simply. "I meant them." Sana smiled, not the careful, guarded expression he'd grown accustomed to, but something warm and genuine and full of promise. "Good," she said, "because I love you too." The admission surprised them both. They stood looking at each other in the morning sunlight as if seeing each other clearly for the first time. "When did that happen?" Thorne asked, wonderingly. "I think it has been happening slowly, like dawn coming to desert. But when Indian agent asked why I choose to stay, and I said this was my home, I realized I did not mean just the house or the land. I meant home with you." Thorne reached for her, then pulling her into his arms for their first real kiss. It was gentle and tentative at first, then deeper as they both realized they were no longer just convenient partners, but something much more precious. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. 6 weeks suddenly seems like a very long time," Thorne said. Sana laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Perhaps we can make it 5 weeks instead." "I think that can be arranged." As they walked toward the house together, Thorne reflected on how much his life had changed in the space of a single month. He'd pulled a drowning woman from the river and somehow found his heart in the process. He'd agreed to a marriage of convenience and discovered it was anything but convenient. He'd thought he was saving someone else and realized he'd been saving himself. Lightning that strikes twice. Very good fortune indeed. The 5 weeks that followed their declaration of love passed in a blur of preparation and growing intimacy. What had begun as a practical arrangement between two people thrown together by circumstance transformed into something neither had expected: a courtship conducted under the most unusual circumstances, with a wedding deadline imposed by forces beyond their control. Their days developed a new rhythm. Mornings still brought the familiar routines of ranch work, but now Sana worked beside Thorne in the fields and corrals, rather than maintaining the invisible boundaries that had once separated guest from host. She had a natural way with animals that surprised him. The horses responded to her voice, the cattle followed her lead, with an ease that spoke of deep understanding between human and beast. "Where did you learn to handle livestock?" Thorne asked one morning, watching her guide a stubborn bull back to pasture with nothing more than patient persistence and a firm voice. "Apache children grow up with horses," she replied, coiling the rope she'd used to fashion a makeshift halter. "And cattle are just larger, slower horses with less sense." "Is that your professional assessment?" "That is my woman who has been stepped on by both assessment." Their conversations had taken on this lighter quality, punctuated by humor and the kind of comfortable teasing that developed between people who were learning they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But beneath the surface ease, both were acutely aware of the deeper currents building between them. The physical boundaries they'd maintained so carefully were beginning to blur. A hand lingering on a shoulder as Sana passed him his morning coffee, Thorne's fingers brushing hers as they worked together mending fence. The way she leaned against him when they sat by the fire in the evenings, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder as naturally as water finding its course downhill. "We should probably discuss sleeping arrangements," Thorne said one evening, the words coming out more awkwardly than he'd intended. "I mean, after we're married." Sana looked up from the moccasins she was beating, her own contribution to their wedding preparations. What about them? Well, I've been sleeping by the fire and you've had the bedroom, but when we're husband and wife, you think this will change. I think it should change. If we're going to be truly married, we should probably share a bed like married people do. She set down her beadwork and turned to face him fully. And this worries you. Not worries exactly, but we should make sure we both understand what we're agreeing to. Sana was quiet for a moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. Thorne, when Apache woman marries, she brings to marriage certain expectations. She expects to be treated as partner, not property. She expects to be consulted on decisions that affect family. And she expects that intimacy between husband and wife will be matter of mutual desire, not just duty. That sounds reasonable. And Apache wife expects that if she does not wish intimacy on particular night because she is tired or unwell or simply not in mood, her husband will respect this without anger or punishment. Of course. You say of course as if this is obvious thing, but I have known men, both Apache and white, who believe marriage gives them right to woman's body whenever they desire it, whether she desires it or not. Thorne felt a flash of anger at the implication that he might be such a man, then realized her concern wasn't about him specifically, but about the very real dangers women faced when they married without truly knowing their husband's character. Sana, I would never force myself on you, never. Marriage doesn't change that. If anything, it makes respecting your wishes more important, not less. Something in her expression softened. I believe you, but I needed to hear you say it. Is there anything else we should discuss? Any other expectations or concerns? She picked up her beadwork again, but her hands remained still. There is one thing about children. Children, you were father before, you lost child along with wife. I need to know, do you want children again? Because I am 24 winters old, still young enough to bear children. But if you do not want this... The question hit harder than Thorne had expected. Little Sarah had been his joy, his reason for working himself to exhaustion, building something lasting and good. Her death had left a hole in his heart that he'd assumed would never heal. The idea of risking that kind of love and potential loss again was terrifying. But looking at Sana now, imagining a child with her intelligence and strength, her resilience and grace, Thorne found the fear wasn't as overwhelming as he'd expected. I'd like children, he said quietly, if they came. I can't promise I wouldn't be terrified every day that something might happen to them, but yes, I'd like children with you. And I would like children with you, she replied. But we agree they come when they come. We do not force this, do not make it source of pressure or disappointment if it takes time. Agreed. These conversations, frank and intimate, in ways that went far beyond the physical, were building something between them that felt more solid than mere attraction or convenient partnership. They were constructing a marriage deliberately, brick by brick, rather than simply falling into it. The wedding preparations themselves proved more complex than either had anticipated. Father Miguel's suggestion of Apache witnesses had led to a series of meetings with the Naranjo family, Manuel and Rosa Naranjo, and their adult son Diego, who had converted to Christianity but maintained enough traditional knowledge to ensure the ceremony would be recognized by Apache law. The exchange of gifts is most important, Rosa explained during one of their planning sessions at the mission. She was a round, comfortable woman in her 50s with kind eyes and hands that were never still, always knitting or mending or preparing food. Both families must show respect for union by giving something of value. But I have no family, Sana pointed out. No one to give gifts on my behalf. Then we will be your family for this purpose, Manuel declared. He was a lean, weathered man who spoke with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to solving problems. Diego and I will stand as your brothers. Rosa will stand as your mother. We will provide gifts that honor both you and your intended husband. The generosity of these near strangers moved both Thorne and Sana deeply. They barely knew the Naranjos, but the family had embraced their unusual situation with a warmth that transcended cultural boundaries. "What kind of gifts?" Thorne asked. "Traditional Apache gifts for bride horses, jewelry, blankets made by women of family. For groom, weapons, tools, things that show respect for his ability to provide and protect. And gifts from groom's family to bride's family, cattle, horses, other livestock, things that show groom values bride and can care for her properly." Thorne realized this was going to be expensive. His cattle herd was modest but healthy. Giving away animals would impact his ranch's productivity for years to come. But looking at Sana's face, seeing how much it meant to her to have these traditions honored, he knew the cost was worth it. "How many cattle?" he asked. For marriage of this importance, 10 head of good breeding stock would show proper respect. 10 cattle, nearly a quarter of his herd. Thorne felt his practical rancher's instincts rebel, then forced them down. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a declaration to both communities that their union was legitimate, valuable, worth celebrating. The cost of the gifts was part of that declaration. 10 cattle it is, he said. The conversation then turned to the ceremony itself, which would blend Apache tradition with Christian ritual in ways that satisfied both cultures' requirements for a valid marriage. First, the couple will speak their intentions before witnesses. Diego explained. He was a serious young man in his 20s caught between worlds in a way that made him uniquely qualified to help navigate their situation. This is Apache law. Both must declare freely why they choose this marriage, what they promise to each other. Then Father Miguel will perform Christian ceremony, Rosa added, with rings, with vows, with blessing of the church, and finally sharing of food prepared by both families to show that two are now one in eyes of community. It sounded beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Thorne had never been comfortable speaking in public, and the idea of declaring his feelings for Sana in front of witnesses made his stomach clench with anxiety. "What if I mess up the speaking part?" he asked Sana on the ride home from one of these planning sessions. "You will not mess up. How can you be sure? Because you will speak from heart, and heart does not lie or stumble over words. You will say what is true, and truth is always right thing to say." Her confidence in him was both reassuring and daunting. Thorne had spent 3 years avoiding emotional vulnerability, and now he was committing to exposing his feelings before a group of relative strangers. But as the days passed and their wedding approached, he found himself looking forward to the moment when he could publicly claim this remarkable woman as his wife. The nervousness remained, but beneath it was a growing excitement about the life they were building together. 3 weeks before the wedding, that excitement was put to its first serious test. Thorne was working on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles damaged in a recent windstorm, when Sana's sharp call from the house made him drop his hammer and look toward the valley entrance. A group of riders was approaching, not Apache this time, but white men, 6 of them riding hard and raising a dust cloud that spoke of urgent purpose. "Trouble?" Sana asked as he climbed down from the roof. "Probably." Thorne reached for his rifle. "Stay close to the house." The riders pulled up in his yard in a clatter of hooves and jangling spurs. Thorne recognized their leader immediately, Jake Morrison, a rancher from the next valley, over a man with a reputation for solving problems with his fists and his gun rather than his brain. "Morrison," Thorne said carefully, "what brings you out this way?" "Heard you got yourself an Apache squaw," Morrison replied without preamble. His companions spread out slightly, and Thorne noticed they all had their hands near their weapons. "Heard you're fixing to marry her." "Where'd you hear that?" "Word gets around. Question is, have you lost your goddamn mind?" Thorne felt familiar anger building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "I don't see how that's any of your business, Jake." "It's my business when you're inviting Apache trouble into the territory. It's my business when decent white folks have to worry about war parties coming to visit your Indian wife." "She's not my wife yet," Thorne said, "but when she is, she'll be under my protection. Anyone who threatens her will be threatening me." Morrison laughed, a harsh sound without humor. "You think that makes us scared, Maddox? You think one man with a rifle can stand against six? I think 6 men who ride onto another man's property, making threats, had better be prepared for the consequences." The tension ratcheted higher. Thorne could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word, one sudden movement, and bullets would start flying. "Jake," said one of Morrison's men, a younger rancher named Pete Collins, "maybe we should just talk to him, explain the situation." "The situation," Morrison snapped, "is that this fool is about to bring Apache raiders down on all of us. You remember what happened to the Henderson place 2 years ago? The whole family butchered house burned to the ground." "That was Comanche, not Apache," Thorne corrected, "and it had nothing to do with mixed marriages. Indian's an Indian, and when word gets out that there's a white man living with one of their women, when word gets out that there's a white man living with his wife." Sana's voice cut across Morrison's tirade. Thorne turned to see her standing in the doorway of the house, still wearing the simple work dress she'd put on that morning, but carrying herself with the regal bearing of an Apache princess. She'd braided her long black hair and adorned it with small silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. "Ma'am," Pete Collins said, touching his hat brim in automatic courtesy before remembering he was supposed to be part of a threatening mob. "You are Jake Morrison," Sana said, addressing their leader directly. "I have heard of you. You are man who believes might makes right, who thinks Apache people are animals to be killed or driven away." Morrison's face flushed red. "I think Apache are savages who don't belong in civilized territory. And I think white men who ride in groups to threaten single family are cowards who don't belong in any territory." Her voice was calm, conversational, but the words hit like physical blows. "But perhaps we both judge too quickly based on appearance and reputation. Now you listen here. No, you listen." Sana stepped down from the porch, moving closer to the mounted men. Thorne tensed, ready to intervene if any of them made a threatening move. "You come to my home, speak of my husband-to-be as if he is fool, speak of me as if I am property to be traded or threat to be eliminated. This shows great disrespect." "Your home," Morrison's voice dripped sarcasm. "This is white man's land, bought and paid for. You got no claim here." "I have claim that comes from sharing work and hardship and hope for future. I have claim that comes from being chosen by good man who sees worth in me, despite color of my skin or tribe of my birth. What claim do you have, Jake Morrison? What gives you right to ride here and make threats?" The question hung in the air, and Thorne could see Morrison struggling for an answer that didn't make him sound like exactly what he was, a bully trying to impose his will through intimidation. "We got a right to protect our families," Pete Collins offered weakly. "From what?" Sana asked. "From Apache woman who grows vegetables and men's clothes and wishes only to live peacefully with man she loves, or from Apache warriors who might someday decide to raid territory for reasons that have nothing to do with me. You can't know what your people might do. My people cast me out. They consider me dead. I have no influence over their actions, no knowledge of their plans. If Apache war parties come to this territory, it will not be because of me. It will be because of broken treaties, stolen land, murdered children, grievances that began long before I came here and will continue long after I am gone." Morrison was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the turn the conversation had taken. He'd clearly expected to face down a cowering Apache woman and her weak-willed protector, not someone who could articulate the complex realities of frontier politics better than he could. "The point is," he said, falling back on bluster, "decent folks don't want Indians in their neighborhoods, married to white men or otherwise. Then perhaps decent folks should have thought of that before they moved to territory that has been Apache homeland for centuries." Sana replied, "This is American territory now." "Yes, and by American law I have right to live where I choose and marry Who I choose, same as any other person. If you do not like American law, perhaps you should move to place where different laws apply. Thorne watched the exchange with growing admiration for his fiancée. She was handling Morrison's aggression with a combination of logic and dignity that was making the rancher look foolish by comparison. Morrison seemed to realize he was losing ground. Laws or no laws, there's going to be trouble. Mark my words, marrying that squaw is going to bring hell down on all of us. If trouble comes, Thorne said, speaking up for the first time since Sana had joined the conversation, it'll be because of men like you who can't see past the color of someone's skin to the content of their character. Character, Morrison spat. She's a goddamn savage. She's twice the person you'll ever be. Thorne shot back, his patience finally exhausted. She's intelligent, hard-working, kind, and brave. She survived being cast out by her own people and starting over with nothing. She's faced down every challenge with grace and dignity. What have you done lately besides ride around threatening people who are trying to mind their own business? Morrison's hand dropped to his gun butt, and Thorne raised his rifle accordingly. The other riders shifted nervously in their saddles. Jake, Pete Collins said urgently, this ain't worth shooting over, isn't it? Morrison's voice was tight with rage. He's choosing an Indian over his own kind. That makes him a traitor to every white person in the territory. That makes him a man who judges people by their actions instead of their ancestry, Sana said. If this is treason, then perhaps world needs more traitors. For a moment, Thorne thought Morrison might actually draw his gun. The rancher's face was purple with fury, his eyes wild with the kind of rage that made men do stupid, irreversible things. Then Pete Collins spoke up again. Jake, we should go. We've said our piece. Have we? Morrison kept his eyes fixed on Thorne. Have we really made our position clear? Crystal clear, Thorne replied. You don't approve of my choice in brides, and you think that gives you the right to come onto my land and make threats. Message received. And what's your message back? My message is that Sana and I are going to be married in 3 weeks, with or without your approval. We're going to live peacefully on this ranch, bothering no one, asking nothing from our neighbors except to be left alone. And if anyone at all tries to interfere with that plan, they're going to discover just how much trouble one man with a rifle can actually cause. Morrison stared at him for a long moment, then turned his attention to Sana. You think you're safe with him. You think one white man can protect you from everyone who wants you gone. I think one good man is worth 6 bad ones, she replied evenly. And I think woman who has survived Apache exile and river drowning is not easily frightened by threats from cowards who travel in packs. That did it. Morrison's face went from purple to white with rage, and his hand closed around his gun grip. But before he could draw, Pete Collins grabbed his wrist. No, Jake, not like this. Let go of me. No, we came to talk, not to start a war. And that's what this'll be if you shoot an unarmed woman in front of witnesses. Morrison struggled against Collins' grip for a moment, then seemed to come back to his senses. He looked around at his companions and saw that none of them were backing his play. Whatever solidarity he'd counted on was crumbling in the face of Sana's dignity and his own obvious loss of control. This isn't over, he said, finally holstering his weapon. You marry that squaw Maddox and you'll be sorry. Both of you will be sorry. We'll take that chance, Thorne replied. Morrison wheeled his horse around and spurred it hard toward the valley entrance. His companions followed, but with less enthusiasm than they'd shown arriving. Pete Collins even touched his hat brim to Sana again as he rode past. When the dust had settled and the riders had disappeared over the ridge, Thorne and Sana stood in the sudden quiet of their yard, both shaking slightly from adrenaline and relief. Well, Sana said finally, that was interesting. That's one word for it. Thorne lowered his rifle and turned to look at her. Where did all that come from? The way you handled Morrison, I've never seen anything like it. Apache women learn early to defend themselves with words when weapons are not available. Also, stupid men are same everywhere. They respond to strength, not weakness. You called him stupid to his face. I called him coward to his face. Stupid was just implied. Despite everything, Thorne found himself laughing. You realize you probably just made an enemy for life. Better honest enemy than false friend. She moved closer to him, slipping her arms around his waist. Besides, I do not think Jake Morrison was ever going to be friend to Apache woman, no matter how she spoke to him. Thorne held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. For a moment, the dangers and complications of their situation seemed manageable. They had each other, they had their determination, and they had the right to live as they chose. But as the sun began to set behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across their valley, both knew that Morrison's threats weren't idle. There were people in the territory who would see their marriage as provocation, as betrayal, as invitation to violence. The next 3 weeks would test not only their commitment to each other, but their ability to stand together against forces determined to tear them apart. "Are you having second thoughts?" Thorne asked quietly. "About marrying you, never." Sana pulled back to look at his face. "But I am thinking we should be very careful these next weeks. Morrison is not man who forgives insults, and he will see our marriage as greatest insult of all. What do you think he'll do?" "I do not know, but I think we should be prepared for anything." That night, Thorne moved his bedroll from the fireside to the bedroom floor, close enough to Sana's bed to protect her if trouble came calling in the darkness. It wasn't the sharing of sleeping space they'd discussed as married people, but it was a step toward the intimacy and partnership that would soon define their lives. As he lay in the darkness listening to Sana's steady breathing, Thorne found himself thinking about the courage she'd shown that afternoon. She could have hidden in the house, let him handle Morrison's threats alone. Instead, she'd faced down 6 hostile men with nothing but her intelligence and dignity as weapons. Lightning that strikes twice indeed. He was marrying a woman who could match any storm that might come their way. But storms, by their very nature, were unpredictable. And in the territory's volatile mix of cultures and competing interests, some storms carried the power to destroy everything in their path. 3 weeks to the wedding. 3 weeks to prepare for whatever Morrison and men like him might try to do to stop a union that represented everything they feared about the changing nature of the frontier. 3 weeks to prove that love could be stronger than hatred, that partnership could overcome prejudice, and that 2 people determined to build a life together could weather any storm. In the darkness, Sana's voice came softly. "Thorne, are you afraid?" "Yes," he admitted, "but not afraid enough to change my mind." "Good, because I am afraid too, but also not afraid enough to change mine. We're quite a pair, aren't we? We are perfect pair, Apache woman who speaks her mind and white man who listens to his heart. Together we are stronger than either could be alone." As sleep finally claimed them both, the desert wind began to whisper through the canyon walls, carrying with it the promise of storms to come. But for now, in the safety of their small adobe house, 2 people who had found each other against all odds rested in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together. The wedding was 3 weeks away, but the real test of their union was about to begin. The storm Morrison had threatened arrived not in the form of violence, but as something far more insidious, whispers that spread through the territory like wildfire, turning neighbors into strangers and friends into enemies. It started small. A rancher's wife in Esperanza mentioning to the storekeeper that she'd heard Thorne Maddox was consorting with an Apache woman. The storekeeper telling his customers that decent folks ought to be careful about doing business with Indian lovers. Word spreading from ranch to ranch, town to town, carried by riders and traders and traveling preachers who saw in Thorne and Sana's approaching union everything that was wrong with the modern frontier. Thorne first noticed the change when he rode into town for supplies 2 weeks before the wedding. Conversation stopped when he entered the general store. Men who had previously nodded cordial greetings now looked through him as if he didn't exist. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Patterson, took his money but avoided eye contact, handling the transaction with the grim efficiency of someone performing an unpleasant but necessary task. "Thorne," a familiar voice called as he was loading his purchases onto his horse. He turned to see Dr. Margaret Winters, one of the few educated women in the territory and someone he'd always respected for her no-nonsense approach to both medicine and frontier life. "Dr. Winters," he touched his hat brim. "How are you?" "Concerned," she said without preamble. "I've been hearing talk, Thorne, ugly talk about you and the Apache woman you're planning to marry. Her name is Sana. I know her name. I also know that half the territory is convinced you've lost your mind, and the other half thinks you're deliberately trying to provoke trouble with the local tribes." Thorne felt a familiar knot of frustration forming in his stomach. "What do you think, Doctor?" Dr. Winters studied his face with the clinical attention she usually reserved for diagnosing illness. "I think you're a grown man capable of making his own decisions about whom to marry. I also think you're walking into a situation that could get you both killed. Are you warning me off?" "I'm warning you to be careful. There are men in this territory who see your marriage as a personal insult to white civilization. They're talking about making examples, about showing other settlers what happens to race traitors." The ugly term hit like a physical blow, but Thorne kept his expression neutral. "Let them talk. Talk can turn to action quickly out here, and you know it." Dr. Winters stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Thorne, I've sewn up enough knife wounds and bullet holes to know that good intentions don't stop bullets. Whatever you're trying to prove by marrying this woman, I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm marrying her because I love her." Dr. Winters blinked clearly, not having expected such a direct declaration. "Love her? You've known her for what, 2 months? Long enough to know she's the finest person I've ever met. Long enough to know I'd rather spend whatever time I have left with her than live safely and alone." For a moment, the doctor's stern expression softened. "You really mean that?" "Every word." "Then God help you both." She glanced around the dusty street, noting the small groups of men who were watching their conversation with obvious interest. "Thorne, promise me something. If trouble comes, when trouble comes, don't try to handle it alone. Send word to me, to Father Miguel, to anyone you trust. There are people in the territory who don't agree with what's being said about you. Not many from the looks of things. More than you think. They're just being quiet about it right now, waiting to see which way the wind blows." She started to walk away, then turned back. "And Thorne, that young woman of yours, Sana, make sure she understands the danger. Apache women are strong, but bullets don't care about strength." The ride back to the ranch gave Thorne time to process the doctor's warning and his own observations about the changed atmosphere in town. He'd known their marriage would cause talk, but he hadn't anticipated the venom he'd sensed beneath the surface of those carefully neutral interactions. It wasn't just disapproval, it was something approaching hatred. Sana was working in the garden when he arrived home, but she took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. "Bad day in town?" she asked, wiping dirt from her hands. "You could say that." Thorne began unloading supplies, using the familiar task to organize his thoughts. "Dr. Winters warned me that people are talking about making examples of race traitors." Sana was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "And you are surprised by this?" "I guess I hoped." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he wasn't sure he understood himself. "I hoped that maybe people would judge us by who we are, not what we represent. White people have been judging Apache by what they represent, not who they are, for many years." Sana said gently. "Why would they change now for one Apache woman and white man who chooses to love her?" Her matter-of-fact tone made his naive hopes sound even more foolish. Of course, people would react badly. Of course, their marriage would be seen as provocative. He'd been thinking like a man in love instead of like someone who understood the harsh realities of frontier politics. "So what do we do?" he asked. "We do what we plan to do. We get married, we build our life together, and we deal with problems as they come." She moved closer to him, placing her hands on his chest. "Thorne, did you think this would be easy? Did you think Apache woman and white man could marry without causing trouble? I suppose I hoped it would be possible. Many things are possible. Not all things are easy." She smiled, but there was sadness in her expression. "My grandmother used to say that anything worth having requires fight to keep it. If our love was not worth fighting for, spirits would not have put so many obstacles in our path." Her words made sense, but they didn't ease the growing worry in Thorne's chest. He was one man with limited resources facing the disapproval of an entire community. How much fighting could he realistically do? That night, as they sat by the fire sharing their evening meal, Sana brought up the subject he'd been dreading. "We need to talk about what happens if they come for us." "Who?" "Morrison and men like him. Men who think our marriage is threat that must be eliminated." Thorne had been trying not to think about this possibility, but Sana's direct approach made avoidance impossible. "What do you think they might do?" "Best case, they try to drive us out of territory through harassment and economic pressure, make it impossible for you to sell cattle, buy supplies, get help when you need it. And worst case, they kill us." The blunt statement hung between them like smoke from a grass fire. Thorne knew she was right. Men like Morrison weren't above violence when they felt their worldview was being threatened, but hearing it stated so plainly made the danger feel more real and immediate. "If it comes to that," he said carefully, "what do you want me to do? I want you to fight. Not because you think you can win, but because some things are worth dying for." She met his eyes directly. "But I also want you to be smart about how you fight. One man with rifle cannot stand against many men with rifles for very long." "What are you suggesting?" "I am suggesting that maybe we need help. Maybe we need allies who understand what we are trying to build here." "What kind of allies?" Sana was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was carefully neutral. "There are Apache who do not agree with my tribe's decision to cast me out. Warriors who think old laws about drowning women for refusing marriage are cruel and stupid. If they knew white man was protecting Apache woman from men who would hurt her, they might be willing to help. They might be willing to make sure our enemies understand that harming us would have consequences." The idea of Apache warriors becoming involved in their conflict was both appealing and terrifying. On one hand, it would certainly make Morrison and his allies think twice about direct confrontation. On the other hand, it could escalate their personal dispute into something approaching a war between cultures. "How would you contact these warriors?" Thorne asked. "I would not contact them directly, but I could send message through people who know where to find them. Let them know what is happening. Let them decide if they want to become involved. And if they decide to help, what would that look like? Probably nothing you would see. Apache help often involves making sure enemies know they are being watched, that their movements are known, that violence against protected person would be met with swift response." "You mean they'd threaten Morrison's group?" "I mean they would let Morrison's group know that Apache eyes see everything that happens in this territory. That Apache memory is long and Apache justice does not always wait for white man's courts." It was tempting, the idea of invisible protectors watching over them, deterring violence through the mere possibility of retaliation. But Thorne also understood the risks of involving Apache warriors in what was essentially a white conflict. "What if it makes things worse?" he asked. "What if Morrison and his allies see Apache involvement as proof that I'm working with hostiles against white settlers?" "Then they were always going to find excuse to cause trouble," Sana replied. Men like Morrison do not need real reasons to hate. They create reasons to justify hatred they already feel. She had a point. Morrison had been hostile from the moment he'd learned about their relationship. Apache involvement might escalate the conflict, but it probably wouldn't create animosity that didn't already exist. "All right," Thorne said finally. "Send your message, but make it clear that we're not asking for anything aggressive, just a presence, a reminder that we're not as alone as our enemies might think." The next morning, Sana rode out before dawn, heading toward the mountains where she hoped to find someone who could carry word to the right ears. She returned that evening tight-lipped about where she'd been or whom she'd spoken with, but something in her manner suggested the message had been delivered. "How long before we know if they'll help?" Thorne asked. "We will know when we know. Apache time is not white man's time. Decisions are made when they are ready to be made, not before." 3 days later, they got their answer in a way that was distinctly Apache in its subtlety. Thorne was checking fences in the far pasture when he found a single eagle feather tied to a fence post with sinew positioned where he couldn't miss it, but where casual observers might overlook it entirely. Beside the feather was a small piece of obsidian napped into the shape of an arrowhead, but clearly decorative rather than functional. When he showed the items to Sana, her face lit up with something approaching relief. "It is message," she said, examining the feather carefully. "Eagle feather means protection from above. Someone watches over us. Obsidian arrowhead means swift response to threats. Enemies will face consequences for violence. So they'll help, they will watch. They will make sure our enemies know they are being watched. And if someone tries to hurt us," she shrugged, "Apache justice is not always gentle, but it is always certain." The knowledge that invisible allies were keeping watch over their valley should have been comforting, but Thorne found it added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. Now, their personal conflict carried the potential for broader consequences involving not just individual antagonists, but entire communities. Still, as their wedding day approached, and the hostility from white neighbors became increasingly obvious, the presence of Apache watchers felt more like salvation than complication. The transformation of public opinion became impossible to ignore during their final week of wedding preparations. When Thorne rode to the mission for a final meeting with Father Miguel, he found the priest looking troubled and older than his years. "My son," Father Miguel said without preamble, "I must ask you a difficult question. Are you absolutely certain you wish to proceed with this marriage? Why would you ask that? Because I have been visited by several men from Esperanza who feel very strongly that this union should not take place. They have suggested that perhaps I should reconsider my decision to perform the ceremony." Thorne felt anger flare hot in his chest. "Suggested how?" "They mentioned that the mission relies on donations from the local community, that those donations might dry up if I persist in sanctioning marriages between races that God supposedly intended to remain separate." "And what did you tell them?" Father Miguel's lined face creased into a slight smile. "I told them that God's love knows no boundaries of race or culture, and that any marriage built on genuine love and mutual respect has His blessing. I also mentioned that the mission existed before they arrived in this territory and will likely exist long after they are gone." That must have gone over well. They were not pleased with my theological position, no. But Thorne, I want you to understand what you are facing. These are not simply men who disapprove of your choice. They are men who see your marriage as a direct challenge to their beliefs about racial superiority and cultural purity. They will not be content to simply shun you. What do you think they'll do? I think they will try to stop the wedding. And if they cannot stop it, they will try to ensure it ends badly for both of you. Father Miguel's warning proved prophetic. 2 days before the scheduled ceremony, Thorne woke to find his water well fouled with dead animals and his winter hay supply burned to ash. No note was left, no direct threat made, but the message was clear. cease and desist or face escalating consequences. Sana surveyed the damage with the same calm acceptance she brought to most challenges, but Thorne could see the worry in her eyes. "They are trying to make us afraid," she said, prodding the ashes of the hay with a stick. "Make us think wedding will bring more trouble than we can handle." "Maybe they're right." She looked at him sharply. "You want to call off wedding. I want to protect you. If marrying me is going to put you in constant danger, Thorne Maddox." Her voice carried the authority of someone who would not be argued with. "I have been in danger since the day I was born, Apache woman, in white man's territory. Marrying you does not create danger, it gives me partner to face danger with. But we marry tomorrow as planned, or I will marry myself to you Apache style and dare anyone to say it is not valid." Despite everything, Thorne found himself smiling. Even facing escalating threats and community hostility, Sana's determination remained unshakable. If she was willing to risk everything for their future together, how could he do less? The wedding day dawned clear and cold with the first hint of winter in the mountain air. Thorne dressed carefully in his best clothes, a suit he hadn't worn since Mary's funeral, altered to fit his broader shoulders and rougher lifestyle. Sana appeared wearing traditional Apache bridal dress that took his breath away, white doeskin decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments, her hair arranged in elaborate braids threaded with turquoise and eagle feathers. "You look beautiful," he said, meaning it completely. "You look nervous," she replied, adjusting his collar with gentle hands. "Terrified might be more accurate. Of marrying me, of messing up the ceremony, of not being worthy of you, of all the things that could go wrong." She placed her hands on either side of his face, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Thorne, today we make promise to face whatever comes together instead of alone. Everything else ceremony witnesses, words we speak. These are just ways of announcing what is already true in our hearts." The ride to the mission passed in contemplative silence, both lost in their own thoughts about the momentous step they were taking. As they crested the final hill before the church, Thorne was surprised to see a larger gathering than he'd expected. In addition to Father Miguel and the Naranjo family, there were perhaps 24 people waiting in the mission courtyard. Some Mexican vaqueros from surrounding ranches, a few Apache who had presumably come to witness this unusual union, and even Dr. Winters dressed in her finest black dress and carrying a medical bag as if she expected to need it. But there were also less welcome observers. Jake Morrison and several of his allies sat their horses at the edge of the courtyard, close enough to watch the proceedings, but far enough away to avoid direct confrontation. Their presence cast a shadow over what should have been a purely joyful occasion. "They came to witness failure," Sana murmured, noticing Morrison's group. "Then let's make sure they witness success instead." The ceremony itself was everything they had hoped for and more. Father Miguel spoke eloquently about the sacred nature of marriage, the blessing of two cultures joining in harmony, the courage required to build love in the face of opposition. The Naranjo family presented gifts with genuine warmth, welcoming Sana into their extended community of mixed heritage Christians while honoring her Apache roots. When it came time for them to speak their intentions, Thorne found that his nervousness had disappeared, replaced by absolute certainty about the rightness of what they were doing. "I choose Sana," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled witnesses, "because she has taught me that strength comes not from standing alone, but from knowing when to trust another person with your heart. She has shown me that healing is possible after loss, that hope can grow from the darkest circumstances, and that love is not something that happens to you, but something you choose to create every day through your actions. I promise to be worthy of her trust, to stand beside her through whatever challenges we face, and to never forget that the luckiest day of my life was the day I pulled her from that river." Sana's response was equally heartfelt, but delivered in the mixture of English and Apache that reflected her dual heritage. Her voice never wavered as she spoke of choosing partnership over solitude, of finding in Thorne a man who saw her as a complete person rather than a symbol or trophy, of believing that their union could become something stronger and more beautiful than either could achieve alone. When Father Miguel pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers from their supporters easily drowned out any sounds of disapproval from Morrison's group. Thorne kissed his bride with the feeling that they had just accomplished something remarkable, not just a wedding, but a declaration that love could triumph over prejudice, that two people determined to build a life together could overcome any obstacle. The celebration that followed at their ranch was small but genuine, filled with the kind of joy that comes from witnessing something both rare and precious. The Naranjo family had prepared traditional Mexican dishes alongside Sana's Apache specialties, creating a feast that honored both cultures represented in the union. Dr. Winters regaled the group with stories from her medical practice, while several of the vaqueros contributed guitar music and songs that turned the evening into an impromptu fiesta. As the sun set and their guests began to make preparations for departure, Thorne felt a deep sense of satisfaction settling over him. They had done it, married legally and legitimately, surrounded by people who supported their choice, making their union official in the eyes of both God and territorial law. But as the last guests rode away and he and Sana were finally alone in their valley, both knew that the real test was just beginning. The wedding had been the easy part. Now came the challenge of building a life together while navigating the complex web of cultural expectations, community hostility, and personal hopes that surrounded their unusual marriage. "How do you feel, Mrs. Maddox?" Thorne asked, as they stood together in their yard watching the stars emerge in the clear desert sky. "Like lightning that has finally found its proper place to strike," she replied, taking his hand in hers. "And you, Mr. Maddox, any regrets?" "Only that it took me so long to realize what I was looking for." They walked towards their house hand in hand, both aware that tonight would mark another transition in their relationship. No more careful boundaries, no more sleeping in separate spaces. Tonight they would begin their marriage in the most intimate sense, sharing not just their lives, but their bodies, their dreams, their fears about the future they were building together. "Are you nervous?" Sana asked as they reached their door. "Yes, but not afraid." "Good, because I am nervous too, but also very happy. Happy enough to spend the rest of your life married to a stubborn rancher who talks too much and worries too little. Happy enough to spend rest of my life discovering who we become when we stop being two separate people and become one partnership instead." As they crossed the threshold of their home as husband and wife, both felt the weight of the commitment they had made and the responsibility it carried. They were no longer just Thorne and Sana individuals navigating separate challenges. They were now a family bound by law and love to face whatever the future might hold together. In the distance, coyotes began their nightly chorus, and somewhere in the darkness, unseen watchers noted that all was well in the valley where lightning had struck twice. The real adventure was just beginning, but for now, in the safety of their small adobe house, two people who had found each other against all odds settled into their first night as husband and wife, confident that whatever storms might come, they would weather them together. The morning would bring new challenges, new tests of their resolve and commitment, but tonight belonged to love, to hope, and to the infinite possibility contained in the simple act of two people choosing each other above all others, whatever the consequences might be.